All right, babies, let's tackle this. First, we need to label everything. So we're going to need our typical short run aggregate supply curve, upward sloping because of why? Sticky wages, giving higher prices, a meaning of more profit for firms because wages are stuck for a time being. Aggregate demand is downward sloping. All right, so we're to assume the economy starts in initial equilibrium at long run and short run equilibrium. This is short run equilibrium. This is also, we're told, long run equilibrium. So let's pretend I sent that through the right point, long run aggregate supply. And we need to make sure we are going in the right direction, know which direction we're going, so we're to label those as the first set of curves. And remember that potential GDP is where long run aggregate supply is always placed. Okay, so what do we have going on? Stock market crash in 1929. What does that tell you? First of all, you want to know, is this a supply shifter or a demand shifter? Anything to do with wealth, consumer spending, interest rates, government spending, any of those four types of spending, right? Consumer spending, business investment spending, government spending, net export spending. If any of those change, that will shift your aggregate demand curve. So what do we have here? Check it out. It's one of the things that shifts the aggregate demand curve because it has to do with people's wealth. So we know for sure aggregate demand shifts. Which way does it shift? When people feel less wealthy, as they do here. There were stories of people jumping out of skyscrapers because it was so bad. We're going to see less demand, right? So at every price level, a lower amount, right? At any given price level, people are spending less on real GDP than they were before. So the economy, you would expect under these conditions, the economy to go into a recession, and indeed it does, right? So our new equilibrium at this quantity and this price level is different and lower than the old one, right? The old one was here, so this is, let's say, GDP 2. This was GDP 1. Where was the price level? It was here, price level 1, and now it's down here, lower, price level 2. In fact, that's exactly what you'd expect on a demand-side recession. And notice that the data bear this out. Price level and real GDP fell. So does aggregate supply shift? No. Does long-run aggregate supply shift? No. These are just wealth effects, and they have to do with spending. And what would you say to a different color for this one? All right, so we've labeled everything. Now, what's the context and the details? Here's the application. Oil prices rose substantially, and oil, if you don't know, is key input for so many businesses. Anybody that uses plastic, anybody that delivers anything, obviously they need oil for fuel. So what's going to happen? This is a cost of production, right? Anything that is cost of production or profit or productivity oriented, that is going to be a supply shifter. So we know short-run aggregate supply shifts. Does demand shift? No. And usually these questions are having you shift one curve at a time. Not always, but most of the time, right? So go down, look through your list of things that shift aggregate supply. Boom, this is one of them. Okay, so which way is it going to shift? Well, did cost of production rise or fall? It rose. And so two ways to think about it. Everything equal, the cost is going to have to go up, right? The cost of production has to rise, whether or not firms can actually pass that along to their customers. Some of them can, some of them can't. Some of them will just choose to produce less because their profit has risen, or profit has fallen because the costs have risen. Either way, you get a leftward shift, right? At every price, there's less quantity. At every, here's another way to think about it, if this suits you better. At every quantity, they have to charge a higher price, right? Remember, price is on the vertical, quantity is on the horizontal. So you get oil prices rising, you get a new reality. This is the worst kind of recession. Higher prices, inflation, and lower output, recession. So this is called stagflation. stagnation plus inflation. It's bad. It actually was the recession that had everybody questioning macroeconomics, Keynes. Does anybody know what's going on? Can we even fix the economy? Because so many bad things are happening at once. And policymakers can't really fix this type of recession very well without causing other problems. And a question some of you might have is, all right, I get the aggregate supply curve shifting in the short run. Does the long run shift? Not in this case, because this is not a permanent change to the capacity of the economy. Remember, the long run aggregate supply curve is always based on the potential GDP, basically the capacity of the economy. All you have here are oil price fluctuations. That doesn't increase or decrease the US's capacity for their GDP. Okay, once again, I've given you data to check your answer. Yes, inflation rises, GDP falls. We know we're on the right track. And finally, one more. What would you say to a nice coral color? Oops, that's more of a pumpkin spice latte color. All right, so what's the application here? The new economy of the 1990s. Computers and the internet began to take off. So productivity is rising substantially. We've already identified productivity as one of the things that is a supply shifter. All right, so more productivity for every worker, right? Firms can get more out of each worker without hiring more, without increasing the cost of production. So this is a good thing for productivity and for profitability. So we think, other things equal, firms will produce more, right, at every price level, and or, right, so that's this idea, more at every price level, or at every quantity they can actually charge less. So the short run aggregate supply we think will shift to the right, and you should get a new equilibrium price that's lower, and indeed inflation does drop in the 90s and production levels rise. So you had some really good years in the second half of the 90s, so much that the US government went into surplus instead of deficit because there's no recession and the economy was pumping and unemployment was very low. Okay, what about the long run aggregate supply curve? Does it shift? In this context, we would say this is a permanent thing. So I think you could make the case that long run aggregate supply also shifts to the right. Oops, forgot to label that as 1. So this is a new permanent increase in capacity for the US economy. All right, so notice that in all cases I also gave you the data that helped you check your answers. You could actually be given just the data and not the context and be able to solve, right? So you know that if price levels dropping and real GDP is rising, the only way to get that is a rightward shift in short run aggregate supply. And if the opposite is happening, you're getting an increase in price and a decrease in GDP, that it has to be the short run aggregate supply shifting to the right, or to the left rather. And if you know that the short run equilibrium is actually rising, the price level is rising and GDP is rising, that can only come from an intersection of aggregate demand and supply up here, right? So that can only come from aggregate demand shifting to the right, and you would get a new equilibrium. That equilibrium always measures where suppliers and demanders are in agreement about how much is produced and the price level that it's produced at. Notice you're getting an increase in GDP, an increase in prices. That's a demand side expansion. That, by the way, is what happens when governments pour money into stabilization and pour money into bailing out the economy. And if all you knew was that price level and real GDP were dropping, you'd know that it have to be the culprit is aggregate demand shifting to the left for some reason, like stock market crash, housing market crash. All the garden variety recessions happen from this side, something that, or a trade war that crashes our exports, so there's fewer people around the world buying U.S. goods. That's going to crush our demand. So demand shifts to the left, and you're going to get a drop in price level, a drop in GDP, and there it is. This has been a walk through all the different types of aggregate supply and demand shifts that you can have. Very scintillating, very exciting, but legit. It explains and predicts all the things that can happen in the economy and also shows us how the government can bail us out by manipulating aggregate demand. But more on that later. I hope you've enjoyed this little walk down aggregate supply and demand lane. This has been Macroeconomics with Selena Lindahl. Thank you very much.